journal which publishes original book reviews across disciplines. An initiative of TheDaak is our humble attempt to build a space for young scholars and students to critically engage with ideas and experiences. In the previous Bethaks, we hosted scholars whose work has dealt with such questions of cinema, security and strategy, digital space and memes, gender marginality, and politics of space. The session today is titled Writing the Prisoned Body, the Carceral State and the Female Body in Jeler Bhitor Jel. As speaker for the session, we have with us Ms. Shayantani Das. Ms. Das is an assistant professor in the Department of English at Hindu College. She holds an MPhil in comparative literature and translation studies from Ambedkar University, Delhi, where she completed a thesis on prison narratives by Indian women. Her research centers on life writing and prison literature, with published work appearing in Journal of Comparative Literature and Aesthetics and Samyukta, a local journal, a journal of gender and culture. She has presented papers on prison writing and life narratives at numerous academic conferences and contributes as a columnist to the Indian Express. We welcome you, ma'am. And as discussant for today's session, we have with us Pratham, who's a first-year master's student at Ambedkar University, Delhi. He's interested in the questions of labor, development, and political economy. At TheDaak, he helps with peer reviewing, editing, and social media. With that, welcoming Ms. Das.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I've shared a PPT. Is it visible?
Yes.
Yes, it is.
Okay. So what I've tried to do, and maybe I should do this, right? Like present, or is that? Yeah, slideshow. This should be better, hopefully. Yeah. Okay.
It is.
Okay. So what I've tried to do with today's presentation is, and I've noticed that you guys shared a paper also that I authored on this topic for before this. But what I've tried to do with my presentation is actually not follow the beats of the paper, because the paper immediately jumps into the topic. Instead, because I think it's a very diverse attendance for this kind of a session. What I've tried to do is backtrack a little, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about prison writing in general, and share some thoughts regarding prison writing in the context of life writing. And then I want to eventually come to the text that I'm dealing with. So if I'm not wrong, I have like 20-25 minutes. So I'll just start. Yeah. I'll come back to the text. I'll come back and I'll describe the text to you, because it's not an easily available text. It's not a well-known text. So I'll come back and I'll describe what the text is about. But first, I want to look at prison writing in general, and then more broadly life writing and autobiography, right? Okay. So prison writing, when we think about it in a very general kind of a sense, the immediate impression that I'm sure in everybody's mind or everybody's sense of prison writing is that it's an inherently empowering thing, right? Because prisoners are writing from within a system that attempts to anonymize them, that treats them as passive, that gives them a number and a case file, and then that's about it, right? So if from within that system someone is writing about their experience, then they are inscribing, then they are reclaiming a kind of a subjective personal truth. They are challenging state sanctioned narratives. They are they're basically speaking against that kind of anonymity and against that kind of danger or attack on the self, right? And that's absolutely true. Let me start from there, that prison writing is working from within that system, right? And that's why when you read a lot of these narratives written by men, women, especially women, is that what you see is that something that is almost like present in every single work of prison writing is a description of exactly that, right? So the very first stage of entering the prison, when you are subjected to a cavity search and you are subjected to a strip search and you are, asked to get rid of all your personal possessions, personal clothes, right? And then you are given a certain kind of clothes to wear. Sometimes you are uh, uh, the kind of work that I was looking at, it also talked about how a lot of the people were clean shaved. They were like, they were rid of their hair, so any personal marker is kind of removed, right? So an autobiographical voice that emerges from within that system has to first address, deal with, and actually works in relation to, first of all, that attack on individuality, that attack on subjecthood, that attack on a sense of self, right? um, the word autobiography itself, auto, like auto means self, bio means life, and graphy means record, right? So the first instance itself, the sense of self, is the first thing that is challenged when you enter the prison system, right? You are, meant, it aims to reduce you to a number. It aims to reduce you to, just one person amongst a mass of multiple people, right? So the material reality of the body under confinement is thus very important for prison writers, and they address it, right? Especially the work that I've looked at, it is very interested in talking about the captive body, right? It is very interested in talking about how this is not just another genre, because it's not just another space. So whether what are you eating, where are you, how are you spending time, what time are you sleeping, what time are you, if you fall sick, how are you curing yourself, every single aspect of the body, right? How the body is in relation to their space, their sleeping space, their bathing space, everything is very different when the body is that of the prisoner. And this is something that is highlighted in prison writing a lot, that the captive body and its relation to the world, and how mobility and bodily autonomy, making decisions about your own body, right? Making decisions about how you will treat it, take care of it, etc., etc. All of this is something that is challenged, and that is something that is then addressed by works of prison writing. um, then another thing is that when one looks, although this is generalization, but if you look at, if you like compare, let's say, 10 works of prison writing by men versus 10 works of prison writing by women, and this is something that this scholar called Judith A. Scheffler has done. So she talks about how men's prison writing tends to talk, aims to, like, does talk more about transcendence. So talks more about, like, okay, I am in the prison space, but like, my thoughts are regarding this, and this is happening and that is happening, right? Whereas she describes women's prison writing as strikingly concrete, right? Which is something, and she was of course not talking about the Indian prison writing ecosystem at all, like she's looking at American works. But that is also something that I found in my research when I was doing my MPhil. That is, in all the works that I read, that is something that I also found to be true for women writers, which is that they are strikingly concrete in their description of prison writing. So they go into detail upon detail about describing their living spaces, so inspections, diet, physical abuse, medical treatment, आज मैंने ये किया और मैंने ये खाया और फिर ये हुआ, etc., etc., right? And what is interesting is that prison writing, see, it's not just one genre of writing. So there can be memoirs, there can be prison diaries, which are kept on a day-to-day record. There can be a work like Jeler Bhitor Jel, which I'll describe a little bit later. But it's not just like one genre of writing, and yet what you find to be similar across the works is they are strikingly concrete. They will go into the minutia of like everyday life, right? No matter how tedious it is, meant to be tedious, it is not meant to be a vacation, but it goes into the minutia of that, right? um okay. Another thing that one finds in prison writing is that often, this is the approach that prison writers take, although this is not what Minakshi said, which is that writing will provide a space for the incarcerated individual to order reality according to their own perception and principles, constructing a persona they wish to project. And often, what they do is that they emphasize their individuality and often contrast themselves with fellow inmates to underscore their difference from stereotypes. So, often, a work of prison writing by men and women is greatly focused on describing how I am not like the other prisoners. So I hope you're understanding what I'm trying to say. So one of the works I looked at, for example, was Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, the sister of Jawaharlal Nehru, right? So she does this a lot. Like, she will describe a lot about how she, as a political prisoner who is only there because of the jail bharo andolan, is very different from a common prisoner. And like, she will describe how she is super hygienic whereas the other people are not, or she will describe how she is here for, her principles, and she has very different reasons for being there. So prison writing often does indulge, like, you often see that this is something that the writer indulges in, where they try to emphasize in their individuality, which just makes sense, right? Like, because the prison is an attack on their individuality, so through their writing they want to reassert their individuality. They want to say that they are not like the others in there. They are not like the wardens, but they're also not like the other prisoners. So that's one approach that is quite common in prison writing. um, Moving on, two things: prison writing and time, and prison writing and space, right? These are the two main areas that I would like to go into before I go back to Jeler Bhitor Jel. First is, autobiography is deeply related to time, right? Because autobiographical writings and life writings allows you to weave together, and this is something that Paul Ricoeur says, that allows you to weave together life's chronology, like timeline. So this happened to me, then this happened, I went to school, then I went to college, then I did my master's, the chronology, and the phenomenology, which is how time was lived and experienced subjectively. School was horrible, and then masters was great, and all of that, right? So it allows you to weave together the timeline and the phenomenology of that time, right? It also allows you to play with memory. So autobiographical writing allows you to revisit the past, reconstruct the past, re-signify the past, right? And this is shaped by, of course, personal memories. It is also shaped by cultural and historical context, right? It is also, autobiographical writing is also an effort to construct and make sense of one's identity over time. So the narrative is about, making sense of, you creating a sense of self by all of these events that have happened to you across time. So connecting disparate events and experiences into a coherent, or sometimes intentionally incoherent, narrative about the self. So I did comparative literature because in school I was interested in translation, and in undergrad I did one project of translation which piqued my interest, and then finally, when I had a chance to do research, I chose this topic. So now this is how I've constructed a narrative of the self, right? I've looked at disparate events, like something that happened in school, something that happened in undergrad, and I've created a narrative about the self, right? I've also done exactly that, chronology and phenomenology. I've also revisited and reconstructed and resignified events that has happened to me in the past, right? This element, encounters a huge challenge when it comes to prison, right? Why? Because in prison, time is not lived or remembered linearly, right? How so? Because the routine is hyper regulated. Like I was saying before, you don't really have a choice as to what you are going to do and how you are going to organize your time, right? You will have to have breakfast at this time, you have to take a bath at this time, etc., etc. It is monotonous, it is stagnant, and it often feel, in the sense that doesn't feel like day one is any different from day two, right? It is monotonous and it is repetitious, right? The chronology of prison life is thus not dictated by personal growth or choice, but by institutional routine, by isolation, by trauma. So, one chapter in Jeler Bhitor Jel, for example, focuses solely on solitary confinement. And when you are placed in solitary confinement, right, like in a tiny cell, um, one of the traumas of that is you don't get to experience the movement of time, right? How do you talk about that? How do you talk about the experience of solitary confinement? um Jeler Bhitor Jel thus is a huge tomb of a book, actually, like as thick as a Crime and Punishment and a um and a like a Tolstoy or a this kind of a book. So it is uses fragmented, repetitive, or circular narratives constantly to mimic this feeling of being suspended, fractured, or time being endlessly stretched, right? And this is something that you find across, not really across prison writing, in the sense that some people represent it stylistically, that they want to stylistically make you feel, and they make certain narrative choices so that you, the reader, feel what the prisoner felt. Some people don't do that. Some people just describe that. Some people just describe that frustration. Jaya Mitra has written a wonderful memoir called Honnuman, in which she describes that feeling of being suspended in time. But she doesn't really use narrative techniques. Jeler Bhitor Jel does. Like when you're reading it, you will feel like time is endlessly stretching on, or they're getting suspended, or it is getting repetitious too much, right? There is a in works of prison writing has to deal with the element of time, because there is a tension between the urge to make a sense of oneself over time, and there is the carceral state's attempt to arrest or erase a sense of self by suspending time, right? Prison memoirs often displace the self by blending voices, or they use collective memory instead of individual I. Why? Because when you and your inmates are going through the same experience of time, like you are going through the same routine, the same monotony, the same stagnancy, then for the prison, the self, it makes more sense to describe a collective voice rather than an individual voice. So that's often one way in which prison writers deal with this suspension of time, is that they talk about a collective identity, not a singular identity. So to kind of reflect both solidarity and the disintegration of a singular identity. So it's both a political choice, like they want to say that this is not just my experience, this is our experience. But I also feel that it is a practical choice, because the sense of self and individuality gets really fractured when time is fractured in this kind of a way, as it happens in the prison system, right? um the autobiographical prison writing voice has to also deal with the dual self, because often these works are written after the person has left jail, but they want to evoke the experiencing self, right? They also want to evoke the self that was in prison. So you will often have this back and forth between someone is telling you something, and then there will be a narratorial intervention from the voice in the past, like in the future, when they've already left jail. So Joya Mitra, for example, does this a lot. Like she'll be describing something as it is happening in the present tense, and then she will say, and many years later, when I was, making tea, I thought back to this moment. So that is also something that prison writers tend to do, that they will play with time in this kind of a way. And I've also felt this. I don't like I have not really thought about this in critically, but I've felt this, that this playing with time is much easier in Bengali than it is in English. So it feels like, if I'm describing it, it might seem to you like, how do they do that? But I think languages, certain regional languages, accommodate for that much better than English does, right? um I think I've not even come to the chile with the sorry. Okay, so the second thing is space. So first is time. Second thing is space. Because again, when you are reading life writing, whether you are reading and pick up any of the major people who have written on life writing, they will always tell you that space is not just backdrop, but life writing is about actively reconstructing identity through interaction with space, right? But when it comes to prison writing, that space is exactly what is tampered with, taken away, given back to you, as a method of punishment and control. So prison buildings are made in that kind of a way. Everything is designed out to, so that you have that sense of you basically, the punishment, one of the major aspects of punishment is the fact that you don't have autonomy, you don't have mobility, right? So how prison, so when people are writing from within the prison writers, they have to talk about the self as both a body subjected to containment, right, a body subjected to containment, and a consciousness that is free to interpret, critique, and imagine other spaces and narrate other experiences, right? So it has to contend with both the being present and being effaced. It is being effaced because of, the architecture and the institutional punishment, but it is present through the act of writing, right? So through being witness to just these spaces. So for example, when she's describing solitary confinement, she actually does not go into a lot of, I was feeling this is what was happening physically, I was feeling this emotionally, I was feeling this. There is a stark passage in which Meenakshi Sen just writes about the walls look like this, that one window looked like this. So it's just description, description, description. And initially I thought like, okay, why is she doing that? But that is also one way of like acting as a witness while pointing out that this whole system is designed to erase the self, right? So yes. Okay, so I'll now come back to the text at hand. So this is the cover
Um,
of the, yeah.
for a sec, there is no hurry. It's a very dedicated small group which wants to listen to you.
Okay.
So if it's not that you have to finish in 25 minutes. Take we like and we're interested. Please, if you need more time to elaborate on some of the concepts, please do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. That's a
Yeah.
relief
It's
because
yeah,
I'm
it
just
is.
looking at time and getting anxious.
No, no, don't be. This is
Um,
a small group which wants to listen to in the entirety of what you have to say. So you have your time. Please go ahead.
okay, okay,
Okay.
okay,
Hmm.
okay. Then I will probably come back to some things I missed out on, but let's see. Um, so this is the text I'm looking at. This is the cover of the text. It was written. Um, it was actually not published as a novel. It was published in a literary magazine called Spandan, and it was serialized. So it was published across the span of 1 or 2 years, right? It was written in about the experience of when the author, whose name is Minakshi Sen, she was arrested in 1970, released in 1977. So she spent 77 years in jail on false charges of being related to the Nakshal uprising. And she had a long detention without trial, and then she was released, right? So 7 years of her life, and she was 19 when she was arrested. So after she was released, she gets a degree in psychology, and at the same time she starts writing like these entries in the magazine called Spandan. And then then it is finally serialized, like compiled and published in 1994. So definitely when you read the text with some editorial interventions, of course. So when you read the text, it is episodic in nature. Each chapter or each, you know uh, segment focuses primarily on the life history of another inmate, right? But it is told in first person point of view, and there is a lot of narratorial intervention. So, Meenakshi Sen does talk about this happened to me, this is something, etc., etc., right? So the fellow inmates often are not political prisoners, which is something I find very interesting, but instead are other kinds of prisoners, who are victims of multiple marginalization, whether it is class based, religion based, sex workers, mentally ill workers, illiterate people, not migrants, Bangladeshi migrants. So she actually makes it a point to focus on other kinds of prisoners, not just political prisoners, which is what she is in the narrative, right? This work, I think, holds crucial importance and is a very interesting intervention in the kind of prison writing that you see generally, right? Not just in Bengali, but across the world, actually. It's not translated, it's not very easily available. So, I'm not sure how long it will even be available in libraries, because yeah, it's a sad state, right? But yes, so I've actually used my translations for this text, but of course I've not, it's huge text, I never ended up translating the whole thing. But when I was working on my dissertation, for which also it was just one chapter, so I would translate the bits that I would think is important. um, So of course, the disclaimer being that some things are lost in translation. One of the things that she talks about across a lot of chapters is this space called the degree ghar, right? The title of my talk itself, the title of the text itself is Jeler Bhitor Jel, which means jail within a jail, right? So she's very interesting in talking about space, spatial configuration. So what is a jail within a jail? Well, these are the different spaces within the jail that function differently and that allow different amount of autonomy and mobility to the people who are imprisoned within it. So one of the spaces is the degree ghar, right? It's not something that you will this is not a space that you will encounter very readily in the fiction that is written about prison, or in, I think, other works of prison writing that were written, that I read for like different parts of India itself. So this is a specific thing that I just found in Joya Mitra's work and Minakshi Sen's work, right? This is how she describes it. So I'll just read it out. These shacks called the degree ghar had no window. The doors have iron railings. The path for sunlight to enter was completely shut. Darkness accumulated in the room even during the day. The wind paced to and fro before entering here, barely making its way in. The floor became wet on its own. The spine shivers with cold. Cut within the room itself is a small drain, created apparently to carry feces and urine outside. That is to say, to ensure that the inmate doesn't have to leave this poisonous atmosphere even to attend nature's call. She can stay here 24/7. That amenity also has been arranged for. One can speculate that the British Raj created these cells to punish disobedient prisoners. In the year 1973, these cells were used again for the same purpose. Somewhere else, she calls them, these spaces, dark and damp abode of the primeval man. Right? So they are not exactly solitary confinement places as we understand them. They are not really um, the madhouse, which is a different space. It's like shacks that were built, that are damp, that have no way for light to get in, no way for air to get in. Dark, damp spaces, where the prisoner is not even allowed to leave the space to go to the use the toilet, because there's a drain built within this space, right? This is a remnant of the British Raj, because the Britishers used this space to punish specifically kind of disobedient prisoners. But Meenakshi Sen talks about how this space has been reutilized and resignified within the prison ecosystem of the prison space in India. So how is it used? It is used as a method of torture, punishment, and control. It is also used as a method of like treatment. So she uses these two words, which I really like. She says this is a place for chikitsha, and this is also a place for shasti. Shasti, you can understand, is torture, punishment, but chikitsha is cure, right? So how is it used as a space for cure? Well, she talks about, the first chapter of her book is dedicated is talks about this prisoner called Asgari Begum, right, who is a non-criminal lunatic. I'll come back to these terminologies: non-criminal lunatic, criminal lunatic. But she's a non-criminal lunatic who's suffering from tuberculosis, right? She is directly sent so because she's a non-criminal lunatic, she should be assigned to the madhouse, the pagalbari, but instead she's sent to this dark, damp abode of the primeval man, because she has contracted a communicable disease, right? Because she has TB and she can spread it to other people. So the only cure, the only treatment she is given is to be thrown into this space, right? Um, with no amenities, right? And everything else, like a doctor visit or special food, TB special food, none of that is provided for her. But the official dictate says that she must be separated from other people, so she is separated and she's thrown into this space, right? The other in another chapter, which is why I say that she's very focused on this space, chapter 6, 7, if I'm not wrong, she talks about another prisoner. Her name is Nilima. Nilima is a prostitute, someone who gets arrested for prostitution. While in prison, she tries to commit suicide. So, to prevent her from harming herself and to also punish her for trying to commit suicide, Nilima is we get a vivid description of how she's thrown into this degree ghar without clothes. She's not given water or food. She's not allowed to leave. Remember, they can't even leave to use the toilet because there's a drain built into the house itself. And she's all of this during January, right? And this is the shasti that she's given. And this is also, in a way, if you think about it, treatment, because she's not allowed to wear clothes because she can use the clothes to hang herself. So this is also how she's prevented from harming herself further, right? So this control is exercised through this space, not just through cruel wardens, which is something that we often think of, like it's about having a kind, warden or a manager. Not really. There is no, according to the procedural law and the language, it is so that they have to be kept in separation, and this is the only space that is available, right? So you really get, like, I think, like, Meenakshi Sen really highlights how there is a hierarchical nature of configuration between the carceral space. So we generally think of prison as outside world freedom, inside prison lack of freedom. But within the prison itself, Meenakshi Sen says that there are these degrees of hierarchical configurations of space according to how much bodily autonomy you can mobilize, how much space, mobility you have, right? And one of the ways in which prisoners are threatened and kept in check is because you can always lose more freedom. You can always be more, like, disenfranchised, right? And this is the degree ghor is the embodiment of that absolute level of disenfranchisement, right? Because even within this prison ecosystem, when they are sent to this degree ghor, they are robbed of any sense of community with fellow inmates, and they are robbed of even a little bit of human rights, which is that, being taken out, allowed to work in the, middle space, allowed to access food, water, anything. They're robbed of absolutely everything, right? And this is a space that Meenakshi Sen herself is never sent to, but she's, very, very, um, how do I say, vigilant of the space, and describes it to great detail because of the kind of attack to a sense of self and autonomy that this space represents. The second space that she describes in great detail is the Pagolbari, and now I'll come back to this, which is there are three kind of people who are sent to the Pagolbari. First is the criminal lunatic, someone who has committed a crime but is, because of because they have declared insanity, they cannot be tried in the court of law. The second is a non-criminal lunatic, which is that because there are not enough medical establishments there are not enough spaces to deal with the mad, they are just sent to the prison space. Yeah. Should I? Okay, I heard a noise. Yeah, they just sent to the prison space as a way to, like, deal with their as a way of to cure them, not really cure them, as a way to contain them, right? To contain the threat to the civil society that their medical condition poses. And the third kind of a person who's sent to the Pagolbari is someone like Soofia Mastaan, who is neither criminal nor non-criminal lunatic, but she ends up because the matron, she gets on the matron's bad side, right? Some of the living conditions and treatment that the Pagolbari gives is that the prisoners are constantly bound by iron handcuffs on hand and feet, and they're tied to iron railing. So that is one of the ways in which they're treated. They are left amidst feces and urine. So that is again a condition that is there in the Pagolbari. And whatever special food and medicine that is supposed to be diverted to the Pagolbari, the prisoner says that the matron and the doctor and the prisoner, all of them kind of siphon off that to earn money, right? So that never really reaches the people in charge, right? And the third space is the division bari. So this is where the Meenakshi Sen herself is located. It's a higher position in the internal hierarchy of carceral spaces. Here the prisoners are educated, they have the ability to present a united front, right? So wardens sort of, Meenakshi Sen describes that wardens never really mess with their food provision because they know that there can be an agitation if that happens, right? So you now see that, like, and these are just three spaces. There are many more she describes. She actually is very interested in talking about this from what I have read. Um, so you have like these three configurations of spaces within the prison ecosystem: the division body, which is for political prisoners who are mistreated, no doubt about that, but they are never denied food, and they're never denied right to use the toilet, or those things, right? Then there is the pagol bari, which is horrific conditions of living, but they're at least kept together. And then there is the degree ghar, which you get sent to if you have done something horribly wrong, right? Which you also get sent to if you have contacted a disease that must, it's like a tuberculosis or something like that. If you have tried to commit suicide, you get sent to that space, right? And so there is always the threat of losing more autonomy. There is always the threat of losing more mobility, right? And so you cannot really think of the prison then as just like this homogeneous static space. There is always divisions, right? So uh, so one of the things that Meenakshi Sen does, I'll try to conclude now. One of the things that Meenakshi Sen does is, when she's writing this work of life writing, and she is describing herself and she's describing her fellow prisoners, she's very, very conscious of her privileged position, even as a prisoner within this ecosystem, right? And so what she does is she recedes from the narrative. She will have narratorial intervention. She will talk about things like, witnessing this thing at the age of 18 has left scars on my consciousness which no amount of time can erase. She will have sentences like this, right? But she primarily functions as a witness, as a commentator, a chronicler of other inmates' life, also as a journalist and investigator. So she is the one who figures out, oh, these funds are being siphoned off. These funds that are meant for people with tuberculosis are being siphoned off, right? She there is a inmate called Soofia, who asks for special food for Ramzan, and she's denied that. The warden kind of tells her, you are here for a crime and you want to keep Ramzan, like, what are you talking about, right? And so she's denied the special provisions that are there actually available, right? And the Meenakshi Sen's, as the narratorial voice, is the one who discovers that that's because these funds are now being used to fill the pockets of the wardens and the matrons and all of that. So she also acts as this journalist investigator voice, right? um, in various chapters, what we also see is that sometimes these horrific punishments are staged for her. So because the wardens cannot harm her physically, they will often stage another person's punishment for her, right? So someone said hi to her, next day she's getting lashed 20 times, but that is being staged for the narrator. So in various situations, we see that the narrator subject is forced into a position of being a witness and a spectator, while another prisoner's physical abuse is sort of staged for her, right? So as a result of this, I think the narrator, the Meenakshi Sen, the author, makes certain narrative, aesthetic, and political choices. So aesthetic choices also, aesthetic I'm saying because she wants to recreate the experience of being in prison. So she wants us, the reader, to feel like time is suspended, or time is stagnant, or time is circular. Political also, and I'm saying political because she doesn't want to foreground her experience as the political prisoner. She already is very aware of how, even within the prison ecosystem, she has certain rights that are inalienable, whereas that's not really true for other prisoners, right? She also knows that as a literate, as a person who has the ability to write, as a person who has literacy and has the ability to frame the narrative in certain way, she knows about the kind of privilege that she has. So she instead kind of like makes the political choice to document the subaltern voices around her and talk about their experiences, while allowing her voice to seep in as a witness, a commentator, a chronicler, and also like this investigative journalistic kind of voice, right? She uses language very strategically. It's a text written entirely in Bengali, and yet whenever she has to kind of talk about prison laws or terminology, you will see within that Bengali like suddenly words in English, right? So whenever she's talking about legal terminology or state matters, she often talks in English to almost I feel as if to underscore the distance between the laws and legalities that dictate the people's lives and how far they are from like understanding any of them, right? She uses a very then within the text itself, she uses dialects and idiolects, Bihari, Hindi, Marwari, to when she's trying to talk about, when she's reconstructing the dialogues between other prisoners. But when she has to talk about when she has to do socio-political commentary, or when she's being extremely satirical, that's when she herself will use a very high literary style of Bengali, right? So she'll be extremely colloquial when she's trying to reconstruct dialogue. She'll be extremely documentary like when she's talking about her own interiority and her own feelings. And I also told you, I think, in the beginning, that when she's describing, for example, solitary confinement, she doesn't go into feelings. She'll just describe walls and ceilings, and she becomes, she uses a very barren, concrete kind of like language to talk about all of that. Whereas she will use very high literary style of Bengali to talk about when she's being satirical or when she's doing socio-political commentary. She often has epigraphs at the beginning of each chapter, which are anywhere from a Tagore poem to like an American film to a Shakespeare, right? And it's almost like she's framing the lives of each prisoners that she's describing within like a literary with a literary reference. So she's also doing like that, like she's also trying, she knows who her audience is and she's talking to them, but she's also trying to talk about the lives of prisoners in a certain kind of a way. She talks about her own interiority in a certain kind of a way. All of this while she never really allow you never really get a sense of like you will not get a sense of her imprisonment from year 1 to year 7. You won't really get a sense of like linearity. You won't really an autobiographical self will not really emerge from the narrative, which, as I said at the beginning, like like in terms of like phenomenology and linearity, in terms of memory revisiting, because she has really fragmented her narrative across time. She does not want to recreate a sense of subjecthood that is linear and coherent and bound together. Paradoxically, in her way, by interrupting linear time, she is performing resistance because she has fragmented her narrative. It's a very non-linear, and and there is no closure. There is no kind of like a lesson learned. There is no kind of a Shawshank Redemption. None of that is happening in her life, not even in the life of other prisoners. Like some people's life, she will just recount as pre-prison life and eventual demise. So she's not really trying to do that. She is trying to, write against the carceral logic of imprisonment. She's writing against the way in which time. She's trying to describe the way in which time is performed in prison, space is configured in prison, and she is really kind of writing against the grain of that rehabilitative ideal that prison has, and that I think we also have, that that the person enters as a criminal, goes through this entire journey, gets rehabilitated, and leaves as reformed citizen. She really kind of challenges that by not giving us the satisfaction, by not giving us a sense of self that is coherent and that is constructed across time. And she does through all of these things that I kind of just said. So yeah, I think I should conclude here. I've overshot my time like anything, but these are some texts that you would want to probably look at. And I would also urge you that there is urge you to look at prison writing by women, especially in the Indian context, because your idea about what autobiographical writing looks like, what life writing looks like, I think they will get very like very nicely challenged, and you will be forced to rethink your ideas about what life writing looks like when you will read these narratives. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Shantani. We would now request Pratham to kind of bring in.
Hi, hello. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Cool, cool, cool. Firstly, thank you so much for the presentation. I really enjoyed reading the paper too. I think it was very well written, and I like coming from a non-English background, like someone who hasn't engaged with English literature as such. I think that paper made a lot of sense to me. Like, I have a couple of questions. First question. So, the paper talks a lot about body and the prison. And I think when I think of those two variables together, the first thinker who comes to my mind is Foucault. So, Foucault somewhere says that literature around prison and criminals is the locus in which battle around arraigned crime is situated. That is to say, for him, um, the prisoner is the side where both disciplinary and anti-disciplinary narratives and technologies are inscribed. So, keeping this theorization in mind, I was wondering about the element of agency of the female prisoners in this story. So I, of course, know that the quantum of agency here would be extremely marginal, simply because the quantum of violence they are facing by the prison is so great. But even if it is to be true, I was wondering in what small ways do they resist the violence of the prison and, and develop anti-discipline strategies. And like one major argument that I could also derive from your paper was about how their deviance and their punishment for their transgression is embodied. It is situated in the body. So I was also wondering, is this assertion of agency slash resistance also embodied and expressed through their bodily gestures or maybe, bodily organization? Question two, there is also this very interesting bit in the introduction of the paper where you talk about how the moment when the female prisoner enters the prison, it is also a moment of severing her from the rest of the society. And this, alienation, severing takes place on a corporeal level. So you have, like you said, the strip search, the cavity search, you are dispossessed of any personal belonging, personal artifact, right? So what happens actually is a sort of depersonalization of the inmate, right? And this depersonalization also involves like you're given uniforms and you're given clothes which are similar, I think, which the uh, what they intend through this uniform is not like to impose uniformity as such, but to eliminate any differences or eliminate any personal traces you might the outside world. So keeping this in mind, I was wondering about the intersection of memory and the daily routine of these prisoners. Like, does the memory of prisoners help them foreground themselves in their pre-prison lives in any way? Or this memory itself, is sort of a martyr of the physical violence that they sort of go through in the prison. And the last question, which is of course, I think one part which I really find interesting again was about the autobiographical self and how it is displaced in the entire process. So for like, if I've read it correctly, I sort of feel there is a paradox of sorts here. Why? Because on one hand, we are saying this autobiographical self recedes, and the traces of the subjectivity of the narrator subject reduces as we move forward. On the other hand, the narrator subject is the commentator, is the critique, is the author, is the investigator. All of it sort of connotes some degree of intentionality. So, right, the self here is killed by the institution, as you correctly point out, but simultaneously it is going out of itself. And, as you said, the political prisoner uses its literacy to sort of write the stories of the subaltern others. So, why this autobiographical self, instead of moving inwards in face of such violence, move outwards toward other prisoners? And how does this entire equation then complicate the relationship or our understanding of self, bodily autonomy, and intentionality? Like, these were my three questions. I hope I made sense. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Pratham. There's such interesting questions. Let's see. Might have to ask you to repeat the second or the third question. Okay, I'll answer the first one first, where you're asking that how do the female prisoners embody agency, and whether that kind of resistance and then agency is in some way embodied. So um, so in terms of agency, what I can tell you is that lot of that agency comes from collective resistance. I hope I'm audible. Yeah, I want. Yeah, a lot of that agency comes from a sense of collective and not individuality. That's one thing that what one sees across the works of prison writing that I have looked at, in the sense that it will not be about any kind of like a heroism, or it will not be about any kind of like standing up to the warden and things like that, but it will come from like a collective act of rebellion where through which one protects the other, or one protects like one protects anybody from being individually targeted. The second thing is that the sense of agency, actually I can answer it better probably from the perspective of prison writing. So agency perhaps is because the act of writing itself is an agential act. At the same time, how do you write about agency when you are a prisoner yourself? So what one of the things that the prison writers do is that they exercise agency by not making certain choices. So there is a part in Jeler Bhitor Jel where this one prisoner, kind of in a fit of is having some kind of a mental fit, and actually I was trigger warning, but actually like bashes her kid's head against the wall. Okay. And when you think of a scene like this, right, there are two narrative choices. One is when you can describe this scene as, the as an author, you can describe this as something absolutely horrifying, and you can describe the person who has done this as, like an animal basically, right, like who is almost like, someone who is doing violence against a child to this kind of a degree. But you know how Minakshi Sen describes it? She writes that it took the it took the it took the warden 40 minutes to come to the prison, to the Pagalbari, and rescue the child and rescue the prisoner. And then she says it would have taken the same amount of time for them if a fire would have caught in our cell. So do you see what she's done? She is herself in the division body, right? She gets to hear about this instance, and instead of talking about describing it in the language of complete difference, she actually kind of says that, this is criminal negligence, and this could have happened to us too, right? So foregrounding that similarity instead of foregrounding difference. It's not something that all political prisoners do. I also gave you the example of Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, who is often talking about like how I am so different than the other prisoners. They're not even hygienic. They're not like this. She might not have made a choice like this, but I would like to think about agency along these lines, not along the lines of like how agency along the lines of representation, right? Um, it is definitely embodied. The punishment is definitely something that is kind of embodied. You see that with Nilima, who tries to commit, who is a prostitute, and so the first kind of punishment that is levied against her is she's denied her of clothes. Denied not allowed to wear clothes in January in that degree hall, right? I Can the punishment be, or can the resistance also be embodied? Yes, it can be, right? The biggest example of this is the hunger strikes, where these prisoners kind of reclaim agency by going on hunger strike, right? Whereas if they were to kind of strike against the matron and or the warden, it will not really be effective. So it is actually that, like I was saying in the beginning, collective hunger strike as an embodied form of resistance, right? Is something that you see that is something that happens a lot. Taking care of each other, what you see often in Jeler Bhitor Jel is that the state really does not take any responsibility for children that are born in prison, right? And there's a word also that she uses. So she says, if you call them non-criminal lunatics, so will you also call them non-criminal infant? Like, she's very sarcastically kind of asked this question. And what you see is that uh, uh, it's like the act of mothering is being performed by multiple women and not just the person who is the mother. So I think, I think I would like to answer this question coming back to the point, more along the line of choices of representation. So that's how agency is exercised in terms of representation, right? Second question I will have to ask you to repeat. Let me come back to third question. Autobiographical self and the paradox of being killed while also writing. So I think what is killed is definitely um, a sense of self across time. Like that's definitely what I would say for Jeler Bhitor Jel, because I don't, when I read the narrative, I don't get a sense of how she went from year 1 to year 7, right? Like, so I don't get a sense of like personal change of views or personal growth journey, linearity, how you would think of as autobiography. When we read something, when we think about that, I was born, then I did this, and then this happened, and you kind of place it kind of together. And I think that's deliberate, because she's trying to say that, when time is so monotonous, and when everything is circular, when everything is controlled, I don't get to say, I don't have a choice, I don't get to choose what I do in year 1 or year 7, then there is no kind of I can't really reconstruct for you a beginning, middle, and an end. It is perpetuity, right? So that is how I think of like the killing of the subject, because you don't really get to see a sense of self, right? Even in memoirs, I mean, this was written in like episodes and then placed together with editorial intervention. Even in kind of memoirs, something that I see a lot with prison writing is that they deliberately want to tell you that this is not Shawshank Redemption. They
Um,
level at which your sense of self and subjectivity and all of that is cancelled, right? So I have written here inward, outward. I think you said something, I don't remember. uh, what did you say about inward journey? Yeah, outward. Yes, so outward then becomes really about but even with outwards, when she's recounting a different prisoner's life in every single chapter, she's not doing it in terms of its entirety. So when she's trying to make a point about, the degree core, then she's talking about Asgari Begum, in terms of, how she came into the institution, and how they saw her couple of months later, and then finally how they saw the death of her death. So it's not as if like she is also recounting the entirety of somebody's life, but rather the part of life that is relevant to what they are saying, what she's trying to say at that point, right? But yeah, she becomes outward. She becomes more like a chronicler and a witness. And in that way there is a kind of an assertion of agency and selfhood, but at the same time there is a disintegration or a refusal to give any kind of linearity or coherence to her sense of subjecthood, her sense of selfhood, right? Second question, I can't understand what I've written, so you have to repeat your question if that
Sure, sure,
was.
sure. No problem. Yeah. So the second question was, I think in the beginning of the paper, you talk about how there is a sort of depersonalization the moment you enter the prison. So your personal belongings are taken from you.
Yeah,
It's like extreme investigation,
yeah,
inspection. And
yeah,
also, I think one thing is like you have similar clothes. So similar clothes, not so much as uniformity, but to
yeah,
eliminate any personal differences between the
yeah,
prisoners.
yeah.
So in
Hmm.
face of this depersonalization, does
Hmm.
their memory serve to foreground them in their past, or
Hmm.
is their memory too becomes a martyr to the violence, like in terms of physical confinement and bodily confinement they face? Does their
Hmm.
memory too become a martyr and it doesn't really help them, or memory still connects them to their let's say prison past?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely does connect them to their pre-prison past. It's kind of like the only thing that they have, like their only belonging, right? So actually, when Meenakshi Sen is talking about this, or when this other person is talking about this, it's kind of like the only thing they have to trade in terms of stories with each other, or when they're talking to each other. The pre-prison life becomes very, very important. What gets martyred is a sense of memory during prison time. It really collapses into one, right? I think the most painful thing I read when I was doing this is actually not from this text, another text. There was this actress called Snehalata Reddy, who was imprisoned during emergency, and because of the condition she was kind of kept in, she died from tuberculosis. The dampness and all of that. So she maintained a prison diary, and there are sections in her diary when she's just like there are sections in her diary when she's written a lot of these things, but there are sections in her diary when she's just written the date, and that's it, and nothing else. Like it's like memory or a sense of like narrative self. What do you even write about? Like what do you even have to describe? How do you even like maintaining a diary is all about Aj, today I did this, today I did that, I felt something different yesterday, I felt something different today, right? How do you build memories when you're like experience of time over from point A to point B is getting so collapsed by its repetitive nature or its cyclical nature, right? And Snehalata Reddy was also kept in solitary confinement, so that was also a very interesting thing to note, that actually like that experience of not just prison but like solitary confinement within prison like takes a sledgehammer to your sense of selfhood, sense of time, sense of space, and sense of memory. And then like pre-prison memories are like the only um, thing that can that momentarily helps against the depersonalization, I would say. I hope that answers your question, and thank you
Yeah,
so much for all of them. They're very interesting.
yes, it does. They make complete sense. So just like we have a comment in the box. So it's from Sunail Izhar. I hope I'm pronouncing that correct. They say, not a question, but a comment, that I was very impressed by the depth of knowledge and the way you brought out the nuances of women's experiences, prison narratives. Your talk was both powerful and deeply insightful. Yeah, so that was a comment. We are now open to questions. Any questions, you can either raise your hand, you can even type them in the chat box. Thank you.
Thank you for the comment, Sunil.
Are there any questions? Sakshi Vadva. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. So just one question. You described that there was less of the feeling and more of the subjective, the description of the environment around. So was there any description of how visitors? So were they able to meet visitors? And how was this idea of meeting the visitors per se within the jail premises? Also, an allied question on how relationships were kind of understood post the prison experiences. So familial relationships, and especially because women are involved, and um, in that sense, how do we look at relationships within prisons and outside prison system, prison, enclosure and outside, and this aspect of visitors, if you could highlight.
Yes, so actually not in a lot of depth in Jeler Bhitor Jel, but maybe I could refer to another work that I had read, which was a memoir, and there kind of like meeting the outside world, meeting prisoners is handled. She talks about it in such with so much pain, and at the same time so much kind of like it's something that the prisoners look forward to dearly because they get to hear news from the outside world, right? And at the same time it is such a like a jarring tone almost in within that experience of being in the prison, because time has reached a kind of uniformity and this and that, then all of that. So when they meet the prisoner from like sorry the when they meet a visitor from outside, then it's kind of like a very harsh reminder as to how the world outside is moving on normally, right? So Joya Mitra describes those experiences as being as some as promising as traumatic, equally so, right? There is also it also creates a hierarchy between the prisoners as to who has people who are allowed to visit, right? What you have to also realize is that a lot of the prison writing that comes from 1970s 1980s India were prisoners without trial, so they were not allowed visitors. they were actually kept there and they were not allowed to see people from outside. But so that also creates like this hierarchy within the prisoners, who are allowed to have guests from outside, who are not allowed to have inmates from outside. In terms of relationship, for these female prisoners, absolutely, like you see that a lot of the gender dynamic is recreated within the prison space. I mean, like in terms of them being mothers-in-laws, daughter-in-laws, etc., right? Is recreated at the same time. As Pratham was also mentioning, like in the paper, is that the first thing that happens when you enter the prison ecosystem is it's almost like you get cut off from the civic body, right? Which also means you get cut off from rules governing the civic body, right? So like you are uh, it's almost like being a female prisoner is a death of womanhood, like your own womanhood, right? So you're no longer you can no longer be the good wife or the good daughter-in-law. You maybe you will be taken back by society at large, but maybe you will not be taken back within the family, right? Because you have done something that is so unwomanly. Crime and womanhood is like kind of seen as so like that. So there is a recreation within the prison ecosystem, but there is also a sense of trauma for the women, because there is a sense that they will not be, once they leave the prison, they will actually not be reaccommodated within the family within that. So there is a sense of that, and that's also how the matrons and the people treat them. So this person kind of saying that, how can I wear just these clothes, right? Like it's this, and then suddenly them not being provided clothes, right? Someone saying that, I have to keep rosa, I have to keep fast, I have to keep this. They're saying, you're a prisoner, what does it mean? Why do you what does it mean that you have to keep a fast? What do you mean that you have, like, almost like, how can you have religion? Like, how can you have feelings of maternity? How can you have motherly feelings? How can you have feelings of shame? So things that are considered very normal and considered in the outside world are seen as something that is looked very suspiciously on inside the prison ecosystem, right? So that yeah, so it's I think I moved so far beyond your question. I don't know how to come back, but yeah, yes, somewhere there.
Got it. Thank you.
Any other question? Any other comment? I have
Hi,
to.
Jigyasa. I just wanted to ask one thing.
Yeah.
Can we add the notion of collective violence within what you are talking about? Because I know, like, collective violence is a violence inflicted by a group of people on certain person. Basically, it could be used in certain things like witch hunting and all. But I just wanted to see collective violence as how collective violence is inflicted by the jail people on on the victims. So this is a question, like, how can we relate that to your topic, or is it possible?
Maybe I would like to think about it in terms of what I was saying just before, which is that there is no official kind of document that says that, okay, because you're a prisoner, you can't also keep a fast, or you can also not have motherly feelings. But at the same time, collectively, because in our collective imagination, we think of like crime and women, and like women who commit crime as being not womanly enough, that in a collective imagination we don't think that, okay, they're also maternal, they can also be this, they can also be that. So I know that's not answering your question somewhere, but I think, like, rather than collective violence, I would say collective imagination as to what we think of as criminals, and how we think of as prisoners, and how we think of them as being like in terms of complete total difference from the civic body. And so we think of them as outside of notions governing like human rights, notions governing gender norms. We think of them as outside, right? And so that then also informs how wardens treat them, matrons treat them. It does not necessarily have to be that it's written in the code of law that they must be mistreated, and yet that's our collective imagination of them. So that's how it gets translated in terms of behavior and how they are treated inside. So I can't answer your question about collective violence, but this is what I thought of in terms of like collective responsibility in how we treat prisoners.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? I had two, if Shantini would allow that. So the first thing that was coming to my mind when I was hearing you was that there is a certain way in which we're talking about suspended time, and I was thinking about things like exile, things like being in refuge, which also has what you call a certain level of waiting, right? Politics of waiting, or just the fact of waiting, and that waiting in some sense also has devoids you of agency, because there's a certain level of nostalgia to be at a place which is, say, a historical past. And adding to what Pratham said about memory, like it's the pre-prison memory is the memory that you kind of hold on to, or want to get back at. So I was wondering that in both suspended time and waiting, the element of nostalgia or the element of longing to be at a place where you're not is fundamental. Does that get reflected, one, in the text? Because to me it seems that there's a difference between jail time, because there's a certain level of dehumanization which it supposedly you deserved it, you deserved to be here because you've done something wrong, and from that punishment then comes that suspension of time. So is there a reflection of nostalgia or longing to be back at, say, to be back to pre jail time? That is one question that came to my mind when I was hearing you say. The other thing that was coming to my mind is a very interesting point that you make about agency, that, say, political prisoners, in this case, the author has, who then decides to speak of other inmates who probably came from non political prison space or marginalized space. And I was wondering, within that ecosystem, within that, on that canvas, if we were to think in terms of the agency of the political prisoner to speak, can it also be read as other human beings being the only agents of change? What do I mean by that is that if you look at time as a conceptual category, the only way you can trace time is for it to change. So the only way that I can touch, feel, express, or note time is when something changes. If nothing changes, time is static, right? It isn't there. It's almost like oxygen. It's almost always there. But so I think where I'm coming from is that it's also because the only other element of change in terms of in terms of what could change in that setup, is because the jail is the infrastructure and the rest of it is same, right? But the only agents of change that can denote time or the passing of it is either your own body, which is undergoing change. I was wondering, because one way in which we do think in terms of growth in the past time is when we look at our bodies aging, right? And if I were in solitary confinement, and the windows and the walls look the same all the time, I'm sure there's a way in which my body changes. So my experience with that. And the second is the only other agent of change which then helps me recognize time, helps an individual recognize time, would be other human beings. That is my second question. And because I've not read the book, and I tried finding a translation, but I couldn't. And then your talk mentioned that there isn't one. So are these two elements there somewhere, in terms of the fact that you could only write about human beings at the end, is because uh, that's the only source or the only anchor of time changing. And the first question about the
Yeah.
idea of, is there a way waiting? Is there a
Can I answer
nostalgia?
your second one first? Because I had not thought about it that way, and it's a very interesting point. It also makes a lot of sense because, for example, the character of Asgari Begum, who she describes as pre going to the degree corps and after the experience of having been in that damn horrible cell, right, where no light gets in. So if you think about it, she can't even tell when it's like day and when it is night, right? So that kind of a that kind of a removal from a sense of others, sense of community, sense of belonging, sense of time, whether it is day, night, Monday, Sunday, etc., etc., right? So definitely I agree with you about the second point, that uh, you kind of then mark time through other people, right? And especially if it comes to a character like her, who is described as being a non-criminal lunatic. So at the beginning of the book, right? So the severity of the change, right, and the severity of the impact of um, time is definitely then gets highlighted better if she foregrounds other characters. So that's a very interesting point. I always thought that she's doing that because she wants to talk about other people's experiences, and she wants to use her privilege and her literacy and her political awareness in that kind of a way. But yes, absolutely, that like maybe there is no way in which she can mark time for herself across the space of these 7 years. So she foregrounds the characters for whom life changes so drastically across the 7 years, and she also foregrounds their bodily changes. So now that I think about it, yes, she has talked about a lot of characters in terms of their bodily changes, in terms of how much they have, they've become emaciated. Their mental sanity has kind of degraded across time. So yes, the second thing about the element of waiting and the element of longing to be back to a place, I think that's not there. But that's not there because most of these works are that's there in prison diaries that were kept when, as and when that was happening. But most of these works are memoirs that are written after they are out of jail. So they are actually kind of looking back at that time in jail, not in terms of longing, but also in terms of that they can never leave the jail. So even if in their presence they are doing that. So actually there is the kind of narratorial intervention that happens is she will be describing something, and then she'll say, and many years later, while I was out and I was, married, and I had moved on with my life, I still remember that thing. That image is something that is seared onto my brain. So not really a longing to go back, but kind of like a horror at never being able to leave is something that is more apparent in these narratives.
Thank
I
you.
hope that answers the question.
Thank you so much for both those answers. Thank you. Jigisha, are you here?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I think a vote of thanks would be in order. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Shayantani ma'am, for the very interesting paper that we could get access to, and also the talk. It was very insightful, very new for somebody like me and for all of us, I'm sure. Thank you to Pratham for putting up such interesting questions. Thank you to everybody who joined today. From the team, we have Chetna, Jagriti, Pratham, Sakshi, Sanjukta, Shushant, uh, and Jikasa ma'am. So yes, with that, we've concluded our ninth Baithak, which is a very great feat for us. Yes, with that, a very happy evening to everybody. Thank you so much
And
for
I
joining.
just want to say thank you, Jigyasa, for calling me, and thank you all to all the attendees for listening so attentively, and also thank you, Pratham, for your questions. They were very interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for taking out the time, Shantini. We know that you not always have that kind of time, but thank you so much for doing this for us. And we hope to have you again sometime soon with more papers published and more conversations for us to come back and revisit. Thank you so much, everybody. And yeah.